soldier had carried on quite a flirtation. Eliza had been amused by Kitty's letters, and curious about this young man who had captured the interest of continental society. Eliza peered through the second-floor windows of her father's office, hoping for a glimpse of the famous young colonel, but could discern no figures within the room, only the occasional flickering shadow. "Perhaps Church will introduce us. I'm certain they are acquainted," said Angelica, meaning her rich suitor who was practically tripping over himself to ask for her hand. The oldest Schuyler sister was close to giving it, too, as John Barker Church was in the process of building one of the greatest fortunes in the new country, enough to rival or even eclipse their own fathers, or at least before the British had burned a large part of it up at Saratoga. But Angelica was enjoying being the belle of the ball too much to relinquish it just yet. "It will be interesting to finally meet this Hamilton fellow," said Angelica. "Livens up the party for once." Eliza shrugged, attempting to appear disinterested, but her sisters knew her better than that. "Maybe if you wore something a little more fashionable tonight, you'd catch his eye," said Peggy cheekily. "And why would I want to do that?" Eliza retorted. "As Mama says, honey catches more flies than vinegar," said Peggy, echoing their mother's perennial advice about reeling in the right suitor, and quickly. "Honestly, Peg," Eliza said, rolling her eyes, "I have no interest in Colonel Hamilton, other than to satisfy my curiosity." "If you say so," said Peggy, sounding totally unconvinced. There was no hiding her feelings from her sisters, Eliza realized. They knew her too well. "Peg's right. You could make more of an effort tonight," Angelica chided. "Most girls would love to have your figure. You could at least show it to its best advantage every once in a while." "I suppose," said Eliza. "But why should I when no one need look at me when both of you are in the room?" It was an honest question, and said without the remotest hint of jealousy. Eliza was proud of her beautiful sisters, and much preferred the shadows to the spotlight. "Oh, Eliza, your lack of vanity is sweet, but one day you must let us help you shine," said Angelica. Unlike the perfectly turned-out duo, Eliza was not one for the latest vogue of cinched waists and pannier skirts and powdered décolletage and pompadour wigs. Just a month past 19, she favored simpler dresses in solid rose, which did, in fact, flatter her complexion, or soft blue, which made her dark eyes that much more radiant, with square necklines modestly covered by lace shawls whose translucence didn't so much conceal her cleavage as compel one to look harder. Her chestnut hair, darker than Angelica's but lighter than Peggy's, was never covered with anything other than a bonnet, and usually styled in nothing more elaborate than a pair of braided coils that accentuated the oval of her face, making her look that much sweeter. All of which is to say that though Eliza may have been as sensible as her mother feared, that didn't mean she wasn't every bit as aware of the way young men looked at her. Eliza huffed. "I want a boy who is attracted to me, not to my wardrobe. Pretty clothes are like the colors of a flower's petals. They tell the bee where to land. After that, it's what's inside that holds his interest," said Peggy, still quoting their mother. Eliza rolled her eyes. "So I've heard. At any rate, you two should head inside to get ready. It grows later by the minute. I'll go back to the Van Brakes for the last of it." "Hurry back," said Angelica. "You don't really have much time, and the Albany ladies will arrive before you know it." Already running down the hill, Eliza called over her shoulder, "I promise." 2. Troop inspection. Eliza's bedroom and the hallway, the Schuyler Mansion, Albany, New York, November 1777. It was almost an hour later when Eliza returned home. She stashed the last bundle of fabric behind a wall with the others and slipped into the house without being seen by anyone other than a garden boy raking the gravel paths of the garden and a kitchen maid ferrying foodstuffs from the kitchen in the north wing. Inside, half a dozen servants scurried up and down the stairs, but she came upon no one from the family, or worse, any guests. As she scampered down the hallway, a tow-headed boy peeked out of the nursery. "You're late." "Does Mama know?" Eliza asked her brother. John Bradstreet Schuyler, 12, nodded somberly. The heir apparent was deemed too young for the ball. Annoyed to have been left out of the festivities and stuck in the nursery with the littles, he frowned at Eliza's carelessness. Philip Jeremiah, 9, appeared next to his brother, and tugged on Eliza's skirts to entice her to play. Rensselaer, 4, followed with glee and honey-covered hands. Cornelia, the baby, cooed from her nurse's arms, eager to join in the revelry. Eliza laughed, took her little sister and kissed her on both cheeks. "You're all getting me sticky," she told the boys, who were running circles around her. All right, one quick loop around the room. Catch me if you can. She was a favorite of the nursery, being the only older sister who would play on the floor with them or chase them around. After obliging them for one run around the chimney, she dashed upstairs and ducked into her room, which was the only dark one in the house. Inside, Dot was lighting the lamps on the wall sconces and atop the bureau. Eliza collapsed in the middle of her four-poster bed. I made it. Miss Eliza, for shame, said Dot. A stout woman of indeterminate middle age, Dot had once been the sister's wet nurse, and long years of intimacy had led to an easy, some would say too easy, familiarity of discourse between the maid and her charges. Your sisters are ready, and you look as if you had just come back from a run in the countryside. She opened the wardrobe and reached into the thicket of clothing inside. We don't have much time. Only then did Eliza notice the gown hanging on a dress form in a corner of the room. She caught her breath. The gown was undeniably gorgeous, with a burgundy overskirt and pale green brocade petticoats. It sagged awkwardly in the middle, however, without a pannier to hold up its ample skirts, which is what Dot held in her hands when she turned from the wardrobe. Eliza did her best to focus on the tangle of straps and slats of the pannier, which looked as cumbersome as a carriage horse's harness, rather than the gorgeous gown. But I told Mama I didn't want a fancy gown, she wailed. It's unseemly for civilians to be dressed in frippery when our soldiers are fighting for our freedom in rags. Dot shrugged. It's here now, and you didn't ask her to have it made. She stifled a giggle, and it's not like our boys can wear it to battle. Eliza frowned, unwilling to give in. It's not right. For the past year, I have spent all my time canvassing the ladies of Albany to spend less on themselves and more on the war effort. If I appear in a gown as sumptuous as this, they'll think I'm a hypocrite. If you don't appear in it, Dot said, your mother will jerk a knot in your neck. She grabbed the loose end of the bow cinching the bodice of Eliza's dress and gave it a sharp tug. Eliza slid across the bed, out of her maid's reach. And that hue is much, much too red for my coloring. I'll look like a bruised peach. A little powder, Dot said practically, reaching again for the ribbons on Eliza's bodice. Eliza was shaking with fury. This is so manipulative of Mama. She must know it contravenes all my principles, and she shouldn't be wasting so much money on a dress when the family fortunes are so tight. Dot bit back a smile, which Eliza wouldn't have seen because her eyes were still glued to the gown. Don't put it on for your mother. Put it on for Colonel Hamilton, she teased. Dot had been spending too much time talking to Peggy, it seemed. Eliza almost snarled. She did not care a whit what the celebrated soldier would think, nor what any man would think. She dressed for comfort, not for competition. But Miss Eliza, pleaded Dot, your mother. Fine, I'll wear it, she said, as if she were agreeing to spend the day with her spinster Aunt Rensselaer, who was so pious that all she would allow her nieces to do was to read to her from the Bible for hours on end, and so deaf that they had to shout themselves hoarse to be heard. Besides, she knew full well Mrs. Schuyler's wrath would fall on Dot if she did not put on the dress. I suppose we'd better get started. We'll take at least an hour to put it on. But she was interrupted by a pair of peremptory claps from outside her door. Girls, inspection time. The first guests will be arriving any minute, he said when Alex had finished. You and I would be advocating the same position. But alas, there are military matters and there are political matters, and when the latter takes the former, the waters grow muddy. I am afraid General Schuyler must fall on his sword, if not for the sake of the army, then for the sake of his country. Alex had traveled north to Albany with a heavy heart. The entire time he was arguing General Gates into submission, the pending confrontation with General Schuyler loomed in his mind. He had not yet met the New York patrician, but had heard only sterling descriptions of his character and his family. Both his ancestors, whose pedigree was impeccable, and his descendants, which is to say, his children. His daughters were reputed to be each more beautiful and charming than the last. Perhaps one of them would look past his lack of pedigree and bring him the name and connections that had been denied him at birth by his feckless father. But it seemed unlikely, to say the least, that he would be wooing any of the daughters of a man whose head he was about to serve up on a platter. Look on the bright side, he kept telling himself. Maybe this will be another hurricane. The hurricane of 1772 had no name, but if it had, it would have been one of the Furies, those Greek goddesses whose only desire was destruction. called himself Hamilton, but he could have just as easily called himself Fawcett, his mother's maiden name, or Labienne, the name of her first husband, because she'd never married his father. She never married his father because she was already married to another man, whom she had left before Alex's birth and refused to talk about, just as she refused to speak about Alex's father after he abandoned the family when Alex was 9. That man, James Hamilton, was the fourth son of a Scottish laird, who claimed that he'd given up the family manse, Carlisle Castle was its brand name, to make his fortune in the New World. No one knew if his story was true, but his attempts to make money were well known throughout the wealthy Caribbean islands of St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Croix, as were his absolute failures to do so. Indeed, the only thing James Hamilton was good at was disappearing. Just as he'd deserted his family in Scotland, he similarly left his children and their mother on St. Croix. Though Alex wrote to his father regularly and occasionally heard back from him, he never saw him again, and after his mother died, when Alex was 11, he found himself truly alone in the world. He and his older brother had no relatives to take them in. James was fostered to one family, and Alex was sent to another. It wasn't an adoption, it was servitude. Alex had to earn his keep by working in the family's shipping office, but even that was tenuous. When Alex's foster family decided to leave St. Croix, they left him behind to fend for himself. He was barely in his teens. His intelligence had already made itself known in the small island community, however, and he continued to clerk at the docks. On the one hand, it was dull work, counting inventory and keeping track of changing commodities prices and calculating net profits and losses. On the other hand, it was fascinating. The great wooden ships, each as big as a plantation house, docked in the harbor with crews from all over the globe. West Africa, Lisbon, the Canary Islands, London, New York, New Orleans, Savannah. The sailors told stories of the wide world that made Alex realize how tiny and isolated St. Croix was, and gave him his first yearning to see beyond it. The stories were captivating, but their cargo was rather less appealing, for the great majority of the ships that docked in St. Croix were loaded with a single cargo: slaves. By law, the freighters were required to offload that portion of their cargo that hadn't survived the long passage over the Atlantic before they docked in the harbor, which is to say, the shippers were supposed to throw the bodies of any kidnapped Africans who had died in the holds into the ocean before the ships sailed into St. Croix. But there were always one or two dead in the gaunt parade of people who were marched, or often carried off the great, dark, foul-smelling ships. Those who had survived the harrowing 3-month journey, chained to a splintery, rat and lice-infested berth, had muscles so atrophied that they could barely stand, their flesh pocked with sores. It was their eyes that haunted Alex most, because even though they didn't speak his language, and he didn't speak theirs, he could still read the knowledge of their cruel and unjust fate written there. Each tick he checked in the category of live cargo filled him with shame, because each one represented the length and breadth of a human life. A few hundred pounds that would change hands in the slave market, a few years of life in the cane fields before their abused body finally gave out from exhaustion. St. Croix was part of the enormously rich Antilles, an archipelago of islands whose plantations shipped endless amounts of sugar to satisfy Europe's sweet tooth, and consumed endless amounts of enslaved workers to grow and process the cane. Such was the demand for sugar that the small handful of islands, whose total area was smaller than that of New York or Massachusetts or Virginia, generated 100 times more wealth than all the northern colonies combined. But all that wealth was generated at the cost of untold thousands of